If you're watching this video, you already know what resin is probably. It's the other hobby material. It's light gray, has a lot of detail, but it's got a lot of critics. And they say that resin is difficult to work with, fragile, and maybe they're saying that it's not worth your hobby time. But maybe they're wrong. Hi YouTube, Garrett here. This video is going to show you how to work with resin, and hopefully it proves once and for all that it's easier than you've been told. Plus, I'm going to show you the secrets that Games Workshop doesn't want you to know. All that and more on this episode of The Miniature Men. All right, if you've never worked with resin before, you're in the right place. Today, we're gonna take you from the box to your painting table. From there, it's the same as working with plastic. That said, let's get this hobby project started. Step number one is we gotta take the things out of their boxes, but you might be noticing resin kits have more boxes in each kit than a plastic kit. I don't know the reason for that, but what's important to remember is that resin kits are not as modular as plastic kits. Modular means you can mix and match parts from one kit to the next. Not modular means that all the bits that come in your box need to stay with that box. Otherwise, you might end up with some mismatched bits, and that can be really hard to correct down the line. So keep it all together in one box. You're looking through your box and you're wondering, what defects are you looking for? Well, if you see resin bubbles or mold lines or small problems, that's not a big deal. We're doing that in this video. We're fixing those. But if you notice a lot of details missing out of your miniatures, or that you're missing parts from the sprues, make sure everything's there before you move on to any more steps. This is your chance to contact Forge World, Victoria Miniatures, or Anvil Industries and let them know that there's a problem with what you purchased. They're happy to make you happy. If you bought your stuff from overseas on eBay from Russia or China, they might be less happy to make you happy. So keep that in mind when you're trying to save $1 on the internet. Once you got everything together and it's looking good, then you're ready for the next step. That's right, it's bath time. We have to give our models a little rub-a-dub-dub because they're coated in a thin film of mold release agent. It's this thin, greasy layer that keeps paint or primer from sticking to the miniatures. We're gonna have to knock that all down with a little bath. So let's get all those bath supplies together. The first thing you're gonna need is a bowl. Any bowl will do, but the bigger the kit you're gonna clean, the bigger bowl you're gonna need to fit it all in. You're also gonna need a pasta strainer, and this keeps your resin bits from going down the drain. Go ahead and get your hobby tool, formerly known as your toothbrush. Please never put it in your mouth again. Just put it in your hobby drawer. Don't leave it in your bathroom anymore. Go ahead and get some dish soap. I've got the generic, but if you wanna get the name brand, you can pretend like you're cleaning oil off a little duckling. Aren't you great? Let's go ahead and take these cleaning supplies and your miniatures over to the sink and let's get things cleaned up. We've got our pasta strainer inside of our bowl so we don't lose anything, and the bowl on top of the sink. We're gonna fill it up with some hot water here. Not boiling hot, just needs to be warm enough to work with the miniatures. Just need a little bit of water to collect in the bowl. Then you're gonna take some of that soap we talked about earlier. Get that on your toothbrush. Get some water on there, get your miniature, and start brushing away. The same way you brush your teeth. Circular patterns, and make sure you get all the spots you don't think about. Be real thorough, because if you leave anything left, it's gonna mess up your paint job. Once you've brushed it down enough, go ahead and set the bit inside the soapy water. Grab the next bit and start scrubbing. Do this for all the bits inside the same box. Then use the pasta strainer to help you rinse everything off. Then take the resin, put it on a towel in the box you started from. Do this for each box separately. so you don't get any bits confused. When it comes time to do the vehicles, it's all the same steps. You just need a bigger towel at the end. Okay, now that we've got everything cleaned and out of the bath, let's get on to the next part. Part 3, extraction. If you've been paying much attention, you've probably noticed that instead of sprues, our resin is coming on these big resin lugs. That's part of the casting process as it fills up to the top. But we gotta get it away from these. Before we start cutting anything, pay attention to what's connected to each other. This guy here seems to be coming with these arms for this torso. Like I said before, resin is less modular than plastics. If you lose track of these arms at any point, it might be hard to figure out what torso they go back to. Sometimes the arms come in pairs, sometimes they're lettered, sometimes they go to specific units like a sergeant because of the markings that are on the arms. Pay attention to that. That'll help you keep track down the line. I like to use little lids to keep all the arms in with the torsos as I'm working. This is why I wash my miniatures before I cut them away from the lugs. I don't want anything getting mixed up in the bath. All right, let's talk about some of the tools we're gonna use to move our miniatures away from those lugs, starting with hobby clippers. Hobby clippers help us move the normal size posts that are about the same as the sprues you've been working with this entire time. Sometimes the hobby clippers aren't enough to get rid of some of the lugs. This is way too big for the clippers, and trying to cut it might ruin the detail on the miniature or might hurt the tool. So instead, we have to use something like a razor saw. I know this might seem big, but it's about the right tool to cut this down so it's more manageable. Some people on the internet have suggested that you use your cutting board when you're using a razor saw so you don't hurt your table. Well, that's gonna ruin your cutting board a lot more than you're used to. So make sure you get a block of wood or something you don't care about, so when you're cutting through, it's not gonna hurt your nice cutting board. If you think that the hobby clippers are too big for the job you're working on, or you're afraid that you might ruin the miniature because of how close it has to be, you might wanna reach for your hobby knife. Make sure it's sharp, and if you're not sure, replace it anyways. You can always get a new blade for cheap. Or if you're very afraid that even the hobby knife might not be the right tool, you might consider using a piercing saw, aka a jeweler's saw, to cut very fine detailed items. This is mostly used for conversion work, but in a pinch, you might need it for some of the extraction work you're doing. If you're working with a saw or drill or any tool that makes dust, you want to make sure you have a mask on your face. Resin dust is an irritant for your throat. It's not poisonous, but you're not going to like how it feels after you've been breathing in for a little bit. Once we've got that all removed, we're ready for the next step. Chapter 4, cleanup. Let's go ahead and get the tools that we need to clean up the models, starting with the hobby knife. Hobby knives have many uses, but for now, focus on using them to clear away extra resin, cleaning up what's left over from the clippers, or reducing miscast edges on flat surfaces. If the gap is really big, use some green stuff instead, and make sure you're never getting rid of details. You might find that the hobby knife isn't quite smoothing things over the way you'd like. So a file can be a great tool to help you do that. You could also go for some sandpaper, or in a pinch, you could use an emery board in order to make that happen for you. If those tools aren't enough, I sometimes use sanding needles to get the really hard to reach spots on the model. Sometimes resin spills over on the inside of sockets and it's very difficult to reach. You'll need a really special tool like a chisel to grind away that extra resin. The chisel is also a champ when it comes down to cleaning large flat surfaces. It does the job of a hobby knife and a file at the same time as it levels out excess resin on those large flat surfaces. The models are all cleaned up, so we're moving forward to the next part, part 5, dry fitting. You might find that in order to get everything to fit together, you need to make adjustments on the model. Bit by bit, you could bend the model, you could grind it down, sand it, you could carve off parts, whatever it takes to make sure the model actually assembles together correctly. Let's talk about some of the tools I use in order to get my models fitted together. If you want to test how things are working together, but you don't want to glue them just yet, you could try using this poster tack that I like to use. It works a lot like green stuff. You peel a little bit off, you rub it together, and it becomes tacky, but it never gets hard, so you can always pull it apart. You can check the shoulders or arms. Maybe you want to try using different arms on a different miniature. This is your chance to explore with poster tack. Otherwise, you're going to be just kind of guessing. Bending resin has to happen at this point in order for things to fit. That means you're going to have to get it hot. There's 3 ways to do that. You could get steaming hot water in a bowl and put your resin in it till it gets warm enough to bend. You can get a blow dryer and heat it up. It takes a little bit. Or you can do it the quick way. Get a heat gun. Real hot, gets done real fast. Bang, 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 bang. Heat gun. Now that everything's dry fitted and it makes sense that it goes together, it's time to start gluing. That's our part 6. Believe it or not, there's actually some tools that you can use to help you glue things on to your infantry. Really small items like pouches or grenades might need the use of some tweezers to help you get them on. I've got these nice rubber coated ones to help me grab small stuff, put glue on it, and gently put it on the guy. I've also needed to use the fine point pliers once in a while for moving things around or adjusting how they are without using my fingers because they just don't quite fit in there. I use a jewel picker sometimes to actually push down on a small pouch or a grenade and then pick it up, put some glue on it, and set it on the model. Wait for it to dry, and then take the jewel picker away from the model. It's kind of got a niche use, but sometimes you got to find something different to get the job done. I've been experimenting with different glues, but I keep coming back to the good old Loctite brand. I use a gel glue for simple stuff, and I use a brush-on glue when it's time to get real close or there's details I'm not trying to cover up. If you're finding that your super glue isn't getting great contact between 2 points, you can try to help it with a little bit of green stuff and increase the surface area that your super glue has to work with. Once the green stuff hardens, it should make a good joint. Just make sure not to use too much. This can also work with your vehicles if you're noticing more wobble than you want and you're not willing to sand it down any further. Make sure you glue on the most important part first. Usually for infantry, that's going to be the arms going onto the torso. Everyone's got arms, but not everyone's got a backpack. And most people have those, but not everyone has gear on their belt. So make sure the belt's not blocking the backpack and the backpack's not blocking the arms. You might be surprised to find out that there's a lot of things on a resin miniature that aren't supposed to be glued down. It's almost like playing with a toy. There's so many opening and closing breeches and moving turrets and sponsons that move around and so many opportunities to magnetize stuff. So don't waste those options by gluing it when you didn't have to. You're gonna be real frustrated to find out your friend can move stuff around and you can't. Once it's all glued down, it's time to fill it in. Chapter 7, filling gaps. You might be finding that there's some gaps between certain things. Parts of the shoulders for infantry or joints in the tanks. So let's talk about some of the materials we can use to fill gaps on our resin miniatures. Starting with green stuff. You might know it as Kneadatite, but the world calls it green stuff. It's an epoxy that you can fill in gaps with and sculpt later on. Green stuff is pretty great. Just try to avoid using it in places you know you might need to sand it down later. Working with green stuff is a necessity for working with resin miniatures. So let's see how it works. First, cut away however much you think you need. Then separate the plastic from both sides. Cut out the middle part that's already begun to mix and harden. That's just gonna make things worse for you later. Once that's done, you mix the yellow and the blue parts together. Get a nice consistent green and apply that to your miniatures. Then you can start sculpting. For situations where you're filling in small cracks, like resin bubbles or inconsistencies or where joints didn't meet on the tank, go ahead and try some plastic putty. In that category, you could also consider green stuff. It's liquid and it goes on easy, but doesn't sand down as easily as the plastic putty. Lastly, if you have a big problem on your vehicle that you're trying to fill in, but then you have to sand down later, don't use the green stuff, use some fine white milliput. This is the same stuff Daniel used on another video where he showed you how to make an entire front end of an impulsor completely flat. Make sure you're using fine white Milliput because that's the one you want to use on your miniatures when you know you need to fill a large gap that you sand down later. Forge World has actually suggested that super glue can be used to fill in gaps. I don't know if anyone's tried this before, but it seems like a really bad idea, so don't go ahead and reach for that. Let's talk about some of the tools that we use to lay in the materials into the gaps and to sculpt them around. I like to use metal sculpting tools when I'm using green stuff or with plastic putty. It helps me get started pushing it around and to actually sculpt it and build it up. If I can't reach the areas I'm looking for with the sculpting tools, I'll sometimes use dental picks to finally get into that last little crack or corner before I'm done. You can also use silicone tipped cake shaping tools to layer out that last little piece of material, or to sculpt entirely with a wet substance like liquid green stuff or the plastic putty. Cake shapers are the secret tool that you should put in your arsenal. They will speed up the sculpting process so much by making green stuff smooth enough and flat enough that you probably won't even need to come back with sanding tools at all, or if you do, to only use them very little. Some people still like to use brushes when they're laying in materials. This would be for liquid green stuff or the plastic putty. It basically guarantees that you can't paint with it anymore and you might have to throw it out when you're done. So make sure that you're using a cheap brush or one that's going to get thrown out anyways. While you're sculpting and filling in gaps, you're going to find that these materials want to cling onto the tools. Dip them in water every once in a while and they'll stick to the model and not the tool. You can use these tools in whatever order you need to in order to get the shapes that you need out of your sculpting materials. Sometimes you'll start with the metal stuff and then move to the dental picks and then finish off with the silicone tipped cake tools. Then maybe come back with the metal tools again. It's all up to you to decide what you need to use to get the look you want on your miniatures. At this point, after filling it in, you might have to come back with the sanding tools to bring it back to flush. Sanding down these materials is about the same as sanding down resin. You may want to add water from time to time to make it easier. Start from a low grit like 500 and work your way up to a high grit like 3000. You've filled in all your gaps and you've made them nice and clean, so you're done. That's it. We're finished. Give yourself a pat on the back. You're at the end of this resin road and you're ready to start painting. Congratulations. Guys, thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate it. Please like and subscribe if you can. Share this video with any of your friends that want to start using resin miniatures. And please comment below if I missed any resin tricks that you know we could use. That's it for now, guys. We'll see you next time. Let's get excited. Let's enjoy ourselves. Let's put ourselves on camera and talk like a fucking weirdo for a little bit. Scene 23, take 1, action.